A lot has changed since the medieval period, much of it for the better. My guest today, Annette Kehnel, thinks that we can learn a lot from the people of the past. However, when we're thinking about issues like our impact on the world and sustainability, the people of the Middle Ages had very limited resources and had to make sure that they didn't exhaust them. So she's here today to tell us how they did it and what, if anything, we can learn from them. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome everybody to another episode of Future Imperfect. And I have a wonderful guest, a professor, no less. So we're expecting some erudite illuminations. So Annette, please could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, Jason. Thank you for this talk. I'm very pleased. I'm a professor indeed. I'm not only a professor, I'm a professor of history and I'm a professor of medieval history, which is a really long time, 1,000 years of history between 500 and the Great Migration and 1500, the Reformation. So a very long time span and a lot of things happened there and a lot of different things. So it's a tiring subject, I have to say, but at the same time, one of the most interesting periods in our civilization, I think.
Well, it's a fascinating period, and it is one of the problems of talking about the medieval period in that it starts and finishes in a sort of fuzzy way in different places in the world, and it ends. I often say to people, nobody ever woke up one day and said, "Oh, we're not medieval anymore," or anything. I mean, in England, obviously there are other areas, but I'm particularly interested in England, and typically most people consider the kick-off of the Middle Ages to be when the Roman legions left. Is that reflected in other areas of Europe?
Yes, of course. I mean, other areas see it more as not when the Roman legions left, but when the barbarians destroyed the great Roman civilization,
Right.
But that's a very sort of not romantic, but unromantic idea about the decline of the Roman Empire and the start of this dark and really grotty, uncivilized period we call the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages and everything.
I'm sometimes told off for using the term Dark Ages, but I still quite like it because I think it's quite poetic.
Well, it's poetic, Jason, but at the same time, it's just entirely wrong,
Okay,
I mean,
right.
It was obviously darker than it has been in Europe after the late 19th century when we invented electricity. But at the same time, of course, Dark Ages is sort of an invention of the Enlightenment, because in order to be enlightened and to make clear how brilliant enlightenment is, you need to make clear before that the world was dark. So it really is, as you say, a time description which has its use in a story of progress and humanity cradling out of the caves and then getting a bit of light in the Greek and Roman civilization, of course, but then falling back into darkness. And only in the late 18th century, when Enlightenment thinkers realized, oh, yes, it's a good idea to use our brain, then the real light came. So that's the story, the narrative that has been sort of making modernity possible. It's a great story. I love it.
Yeah, and in many ways, I suppose a lot of people's modern idea of the medieval is very shaped by modern politics and how we feel we've progressed a long way. And people have absurd notions like people didn't wash in the medieval period, or there was no written word, there was no administration, or everybody was just fighting everybody all the time. How would you describe the Middle Ages in broad brushstrokes for a modern audience that maybe doesn't know?
Well, things were different, but I keep saying actually there was human life before the invention of the washing machine. I mean, I'm talking and working together with students, so people from the young generation, and we are just about to rediscover, doctors and medical advisors are rediscovering that we wash far too often. It's not good for our skin to be washed regularly in this intensity as we do. So many people say actually our skin needs less sort of soap and water and everything. So you never know whether washing is really a sign of civilization or it's a sign of good health care. People were certainly less inclined, or they didn't have to shop as much as we do. people were used to live in a different sort of communication and cooperation with others. And also there might be one difference to today. I mean, they lived not in an empty world, but in a world that in comparison to today was not full. It was a world less crowded. So that makes certainly a lot of difference, yeah.
How much less crowded? Because sometimes I have difficulty explaining to people. I did a talk on population of England during Doomsday, the Doomsday book. It is a post the Norman invasion. And it depends how you count the numbers up. And there are lots of types of people missed out from that record. Women in particular and children are not mentioned. But average, people talked about roughly 4 million people in England-ish in the medieval period. And that contrasts with nearly 70 million today. And that's a vast difference.
Yep.
Communication was much slower as well. So even if you lived in a big town, was probably only a few thousand people at most.
Yeah.
Is that your experience? Is that shared across?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we do have figures, all of them obviously sort of relying on estimates, but, educated guesses, very educated estimates. So around the year 1000, the European continent, about 20 million people.
In the whole of Europe?
That's the estimate for the year 1000. And then we have what we today call a climate change of the medieval period from the 10th to the late 13th century. And then you have sort of favorable summers, warmer climate, and better conditions for Homo sapiens. So the population up to the year 1300 rose to more than 70 million. So you have 300 years and a growth of population from 20 million in Europe to 73 million or so in Europe. It depends. Some say it was even 80 or a bit less. So it's really population growth that triples or even is a fourfold growth.
But even that, by modern standards, you go to a city like Paris or Berlin or London, and people live densely. They live literally on top of one another. How would you describe even a big city in the medieval period? Can you describe it to us so that we can imagine what it might have been like?
Well, the thing is, when we think of medieval city life, we usually have pictures in our mind that roughly follow Charles Dickens' description of Oliver Twist or so, But that was 19th century. That was actually the first sort of bloom of modernity and industrialization. In medieval towns, well, the Name of the Rose or films like that would give us an idea. But I think, of course, these places were crowded, but in comparison to today, I mean, a medieval city, Cologne was probably the biggest city in Germany, or London in England. And I think they were 5,000 or 10,000.
So that's a small provincial town today. So in a way, the way to imagine it is if you live in a small provincial town now, would it compare?
Well, no, it always is a matter of comparison with what you're used to, So they were densely populated, these cities, but at the same time, today for us, it would probably be rather relaxed. The rhythms of life were maybe, in comparison to today, a bit more human. They were working less hours than we do today.
Oh, you're going to have to expand on that because people want to know details. Because there's one of the things I often talk to people about is they might have done less work, more physical work, perhaps. I mean, what's your understanding of that?
Well, again, historians did such a lot of research. So there is Juliet Shore. I think she's an economist who works in a historical way as well. And she found out that probably around 1,300 people were working maybe 1,600 hours a year. In comparison to today, we work about, some of us, 2,000 hours a year, others maybe 1,600 or whatever. But before the year 1300, in the 11th and 12th century, we probably had 1,400 working hours per year because people had more holiday, saint days. They had another invention of the Middle Ages is what the Germans call the Blue Monday. the Monday you take off because you were drinking too much on the weekend.
Okay.
I think Saint Monday or whatever you call it, then plenty of holidays.
Right.
If you had to do a day's work for your landlord or your feudal lord, this was about 5 hours or so.
5-hour days.
That was a day's work. And then it got even worse because the plague, the Black Death in the 14th century would reduce the population. And that would sort of give even more liberty to the workers.
So could we describe it for a modern working audience that they're part-time, perhaps 3 days a week-ish?
Well, not 3 days, maybe 4 days a week. And of course, it was a different sort of work that people wouldn't be used to, except scribes in scriptoria and in chancery work and so. But they wouldn't be used to sit around all day. They were always moving. The democratization of the chair. Yeah. It's an invention of the 19th century. Churches didn't have
pews we call them, the bench seats.
Yeah, they wouldn't have bench seats. You would stand in church and you would carry around benches or tables and then put them aside. So I think it was a much more sort of mobile society than we are used to.
And probably more physical as well, because the world required more physicality of you. There wasn't an internal combustion engine. There were animals to help out as well, but those had a cost associated with them. And quite frankly, if you were, of moderate income, you probably just got on and did it yourself, carrying water.
Yep.
If you needed a fire, you had to go and get the logs, chop them, or whatever it might be. So everybody expected as the normal rhythm of life to be doing a lot of physical labor.
It would be physical labor on the one side, but it would also be sort of a daily routine of more physical activity.
Yes, because everything required more physical work.
Yeah.
If you wanted to boil a kettle or the equivalent, you needed to go and get the water or have it got for you by somebody. And I do a lot of work with horses. I clean out horses every day. And people say, did you go to the gym much? And I say, no, I can't think of anything worse than going to the gym because I've literally just moved half a ton of horse poo,
They poo a lot, these horses. Yeah.
Yeah, they do.
So you have horses?
Yeah, I do. I train them and I do medieval jousting and that kind of stuff as well. So this is a passion area for me.
Oh, great. I do have a horse, by the way, but I don't do the cleaning of the stable.
What kind of horse?
It's a Welsh Cob.
Really good.
A good horse.
They were good. There was a breed of horses that were designed for kind of good work as well. Not plough horses as such, but they were for carrying things and, for the commerce. They were the HGVs, the heavy goods vehicles of the era. That was wonderful, wonderful.
That's another topic. You have animal labor in the middle. Maybe we should just point out, I'm not trying to sort of romanticize the medieval period. I'm not saying people had a better life, but what I'm saying, they had a different life. And we tend to think they were poor because they didn't have SUVs or TV or whatever. I think that's sort of what a problem of hindsight bias. If I look at my childhood from the point of view of my children, I had a deprived childhood because I didn't have a mobile phone.
Yes. And I've been talking to the younger generation about things like easy access to screens, touch screens, or if you wanted, back when I first started to study, if you wanted to look something up, you had to go to a library and think of a book or a topic, and you had to go and find it. Now, well, it's even changed in the last few years. You can use AI to search for you, but you had to sort of have a clue about what you were looking for, and then you had to spend more effort to actually find information, where we have information at our fingertips now, almost literally. Still doesn't mean, I think there's probably just as much ignorance around as there ever has been, bizarrely.
Yeah.
But if we get back to the whole medieval period, do you feel from your studies that it changed substantially over that 1,000 years? I think that's pretty obvious it did, but are there any particular points where you've noticed a major change in technology or attitudes?
I think the invention of glasses in the late 13th century was certainly a change for a lot of people.
Okay.
It was an Italian Dominican friar, I think, who invented glasses. And that's obviously for the reading, for people who did intellectual work.
What about women's rights, for example?
We usually say that the Reformation was a big cut for women's rights.
A big cut, a big reduction.
A reduction of rights for women, yeah. Because women legally weren't entitled to do business and things like that in the Middle Ages because the Roman law was still sort of prevalent. But we know now that they didn't appear in the books, but at the same time, they were carrying out a lot of business. They were working. One of my themes is the Beguines, Beguinage that were found in the cities of Flanders in the late 13th century, when economy was booming and everything was really sort of getting very well. We have women founding city quarters for themselves. And they were living there, building houses, living together, or living in individual houses with servants and everything. But they had the right and were entitled to keep businesses, to keep shops, or to work in textile industries, to work wherever. And there you see how normal it was for these women to be active in the market. We even have evidence that in Marseille, for example, these women were very active as loan givers or for startup companies. So if you're, newlywed couple wanting to open a bakery, they would go to the Beguinage and one of these Beguines giving her a credit, a loan. So that's where they become very visible. Anyway, with the Reformation, we think that the rights of women were cut down. I mean, the reduction to the wife of the man, sort of drawn on the image of Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora, household where she keeps the fire and feeds the family, and he is the most important person. That's certainly a cut, yeah.
That's interesting. So in many ways, in the medieval period, we sort of think of progress as a linear improvement, perhaps, in whatever we mean by improvement. Certainly technology changes. But what you're saying there is that it isn't linear at all. There are dramatic collapses in rights. And I suppose you've got the beginning of the medieval period arguably was a massive change. The Romans left, England in particular.
Some of them left, but most of them had children who stayed, or women who stayed. Don't you have in York this African lady, Eborasiensis, who, an African Roman lady buried in York. And obviously these people left traces.
I think the evidence I've seen, and it's not an area I've studied a lot, but it's an area of interest because I was thinking with massive change comes all sorts of changes in technology and changes in thinking. And I think the evidence is very, very mixed. I think it appears that some places almost sort of grabbed their stuff. Suddenly all left, like shoes left in places you wouldn't expect shoes. And other places don't appear to show any change at all, as if it's a very localized phenomenon. If everybody gets together and just decides to go for the boats, that happens. And other people don't maybe get the memo or decide, actually, no, this is our home, we're staying here.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very important point because you have local differences. But just like today, change and transformation always happens. Talking about changes after the Romans left, I mean, St. Patrick, the Irish Patrick, I mean, he was the son of a Roman soldier or a diacon, a clergyman, and he then goes to Ireland, or I think he was taken there in slavery in the first place.
Yes, I think he was a slave initially, yes.
And then after that, I mean, with the sort of introduction of this new faith he brought to the island, the introduction of scripture was certainly a very big change for Irish societies because you all of a sudden wrote down what was Celtic law before and everything. Sort of lots of traditions were certainly kept in books or rolls or on parchment, whatever. And I think that might be a big change that happened in different parts of Europe at different times, but certainly had an impact on the way we remember tradition and we work with stories from the past or visions for the future. So that's certainly a big sort of paradigm change, a paradigmatic change in the mentalities.
I wanted to go back a little bit. You mentioned change in climate as a big thing, population growing over 300 years. Do you want to sort of tell us a bit more about that? Because that sounds like there's some parallels for today, perhaps. And I wondered if that is the case, that the parallels are not that parallel at all. But changing climate makes a big difference. to societies?
The thing is, it makes, I don't know how you feel in Britain, but I have a feeling in Germany, we have all these signs of climate change. We have floods and we have people dying and we have drought and whatever. But at the same time, for most people, it just feels like another Jahrhundertflut, a century flood, And we don't really realize that it was the third century flood we had, or the fifth century flood we had within 5 years.
Yes.
So I think climate change is a very interesting phenomena because we seem to sort of not deny it, but emotionally we realize something is changing, but at the same time we stick to normality.
That's human.
And I think people in the Middle Ages wouldn't have a different mindset. It was a more favorable climate in the years from 1000 to 1300. What happened was that people were healthier, they lived longer, and obviously so they had a demographic growth. At the same time, you have more mobility and you have the founding of cities. So you have lots of towns, newly found towns, and the rise of trade. But you don't see sort of reflections in the sources about, oh, no, we have a climate change. The weather is actually getting better. You have reports on this was a nice summer, or this was a bad summer, or this was a horrible flood. Even within this period, we have this great Marcellus flood. We have two of them, one in the early 13th century when the climate was good, and there was they calculate more than 30,000 people killed in sort of England, Denmark, and the Ostsee, the German and then the Dutch Sea. You have whole islands sort of given to the sea and everything. So people realize, this was really a bad thing that happened. And then you have a second one in 1362, the second Marcellus flood, when again 25,000 people probably were killed.
And that's a big proportion of the population as well.
Yeah. But then how do people cope with this? What do? They start building dikes or canal systems. They try to retrieve land from the sea. I think Bristol was one of the cities heavily affected, and they built a great ditch, or they moved to different places. So the Massif Central in France, they started sort of moving there and settling there in the 14th century at places that had been sort of not very favorable for human settlement, but then they try. So actually mobility, moving, and migration is an answer to cope with climate change, and obviously taking action. That's what we should do today,
Mm-hmm.
Taking action, do something about it.
Yeah, but human psychology is such that we tend to deny things. People do it on a human level. They deny illness that they need treatment for quite frequently. And on a bigger scale, they deny there's a problem going on. It seems to be a human species trait to hope it goes away if we don't think about it too much.
That's what we call deliberate ignorance, isn't it? You sort of think, if I close my eyes, it will go away. And then sometimes it's true and it works, but sometimes it doesn't work.
And sometimes actually dealing with a big issue takes a lot of effort. And the phenomenon of people hoping somebody else does it. I could just get on with things. It's terrible, but I'm just going to crack on with what I'm doing. And I hope it's somebody else's problem.
Yes.
Of course, it isn't. It's all of our problems. But, we will, we'll see. Back to the Middle Ages and things like that. You talked a little bit about microfinance, about people lending small loans. Now, lending money in the medieval period is tied up with religion a little bit, as far as I understand it, the sort of money for interest. Is that true? The Jewish population were often attached. They were the ones allowed to lend money, but you will know more about that than I do. There were some terrible things happened in England to do with Jewish communities, awful things.
Oh, terrible things happened all over Europe with Jewish people. And one of the insults, or one of the big issues was, of course, as a true Christian, you were officially not allowed to take interest, as you say. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Jewish moneylenders were an exception because they didn't sort of fall onto this Christian law. And obviously, for a flourishing community and for a flourishing economy, you need loans and you need to invest money. So that's a very old story about it's forbidden to take interest, but at the same time, we know we need it. And normal people need it, merchants need sort of loans and then interest, and everybody needs it. The king
king, yeah.
needs it, the emperor needs it. And so that means everybody needs the juice. But at the same time, then, obviously, lending money and taking interest for the loan was just part and parcel also of medieval economy. So that's one of the results more recent research in economic history has made very clear, that it is a myth to think that money lending was sort of not part of medieval economies and only an invention of capitalism or early modern economy. And we see that if we look at sort of city archives, and then they kept books on loans. So Gabriela Signori, for example, she did a study on Basel. You know, they had a book which is called Vergichtbuch. And there you could, as a burgher of the city of Basel, write into it, I was giving money to this or that person. And then once you get it back, it's crossed out. And there were different systems to organize money lending in cities on different levels. And the fact that they didn't officially take interest is usually sort of bound up with, it's not called interest.
Right.
It's
Okay.
then maybe called, it's risk money, or it's
A fee. Is it a fee or something? Or
it's a fee, or you note a higher sum in the Vergichtbuch than you actually give. So that's part of the loan. So you give someone £20 and you write down in the book £21.
Okay.
So the £1 would be the interest rate.
So there's a law, religious law prohibits something, but you get around it because you absolutely need it. Yeah.
Yes, you get around it. And I think what research did for a long time, they trusted too much in the written law. And now we realize, people were thinking a lot about whether it's good to give loans and take interest. Giving loans was okay, but taking interest was the problem. But at the same time, you have, and that's very interesting, amongst the mendicant religious communities, mendicant friars are communities who live without private property and without communal property. So that's a very specialized group within the cities. But they act as confessors to a lot of merchants and undertakers and everything. And there you can see they are in touch with the reality of everyday life. And so they develop sort of a language of how and why taking loans or taking interests for a loan. Then you say, you have to take a fee for the risk, or you have to take a fee for the investment you can't do yourself during the time when you give out the loan. And so they make a very clear distinction between different sorts of reasons for officially and legally taking interest. Johannes Olivi is one of these people who lived in France and in Paris and in Rome. And he thinks a lot about this, but at the same time, he's a very sort of decent, orderly little friar within his community in Navarra, I think. Yeah.
It's interesting that there's a pragmatic view, even from the religious authorities, that, look, we need to do this whole making a return on the loaning the money, because otherwise society can't function. We just can't do it. And it's in our rules, but we can get around it. We'll get around it this way.
Yes, but the main reason for this rule was actually Aristotle, because he was against interest.
Oh, okay. So it's not a Christian thing, really. It predates.
It's money is a dead thing, and money can't give birth. Sort of, if money reproduces, that's unnatural. So that was Aristotle who actually sort of was the inspiration. And interestingly enough, in with scholastic times in the 12th and 13th century, and Thomas of Aquinas in the 13th century, all this Aristotle rediscovery gives sort of reason to discuss the issue, because these people know, of course we need to take interest. But Aristotle said, money is not entitled to reproduce itself and to grow. Yeah. Anyway, that's a different thing. But maybe it's more important to show that in medieval cities, or to mention that in medieval cities in the late medieval times, in the 15th century, the city councils and the bishops, at a time of economic growth and really sort of very, what we would call progress in economic terms and expansion, they started realizing, okay, if you have economic growth, you not only have those winners, but you also produce losers. And we need to do something for those people who do not profit from our rise. And so they start developing what we today call microcredit banks. So you have Muhammad Yunus, who actually invented that idea in the late 20th century for Bangladesh, but also then for other countries. And the notion of a microcredit bank is that you actually give loans to people who don't have much. And in the late 15th century, you could secure the loan by taking pledges. So you can put in your winter coat in April, you go to the bank, you get a loan, they keep your winter coat, you get the loan, and then you buy seed or whatever, leather for the shoes you produce, or seed for the little farm you have. And then after the harvest in September, you pay back the loan and then have your winter coat back. So that's really the principle of microcredit institutions today as well, taking out small loans and investing them into your business, and thus giving a chance to people on a small scale to participate in market activity and not drive them into poverty.
And that's fascinating because they're also short-term as well, necessarily short-term loans.
Yeah, very short-term. It's a very sort of elaborate organization. It's a community thing, not a church thing. Even so, the bishops, and also mendicant friars support this very much. But usually it's the city council who is founding these houses.
So the secular authorities.
Yes. And you have to sort of, they organize it with annual turning offices. You have women being part of the council or the head of these places. So it's a very interesting thing. And then on a small scale level, you have all the books these banks kept. And they really still are around in the archives of mostly every Italian city. My colleague Tanya Skamprax from Graz, she works on all this. And lots of Italian people work on it as well, scholars work on it. And the problem there is, it's not we don't have enough sources, but the problem is the other way around. We have too many sources. And it's just, you don't really know whether you want to spend your lifetime reading these account books where you find, a pair of socks as a pledge for a loan for a little servant, or then jewelry or little furniture pieces or marriage rings. Very often marriage jewelry is handed in, and it gives an insight, but it's very hard work.
And as you say, these are ordinary things with ordinary people. Mm. These aren't the great and powerful that are going to be written about by anybody else. These are people making their way through life, needing a micro loan to, as you say, buy leather, to make some shoes, to sell them. And in many ways, I find that more fascinating, because the wealthy in society get disproportionate attention even now.
Yes.
Let's face it.
Very right. I agree.
Yeah. And I think ordinary people are more important, because there's more of us who are ordinary. And I guess I'm not ordinary in many ways, doing all the things I do, but I find it more interesting to talk about ordinary people's lives. And the great thing about that information, like the magistrates' court rolls in England that I've looked at, there's lots of ordinary but very serious problems for ordinary people. If somebody's gutter is leaking into your garden, that's a real problem, because you can't grow your food, and that can be lethal. That can really affect you. Mm-hmm. And it matters so much, these people. And we might sometimes go, oh, well, that's so funny. Somebody's cesspit is overfilled and then somebody's being sued and they've been fined $1. And it's like, it isn't funny, because this is really important to somebody's life. And made a huge difference. And I think we need to honor the past and the ordinary people of the past more than we perhaps do sometimes.
Yes, I agree. I just heard a paper by my colleague Spike Gibbs, who works on stray animals in England.
Ah,
And there as well, you realize how this was a real problem for the farmers in, I think, East Anglia is it, where he studies the communities. Because these stray animals, they destroy the crops or they are a danger for the fields and things like that. But then the landlord is obliged to take the stray animal and to feed it and to make known to everybody that there is a stray animal. This horse is hanging around. Please get it back. But if nobody comes, the feudal lord has to feed this horse for a year. And only after a year, it's going into his possession.
right. So there were very strong rules.
There are really strong rules, and you have all these law cases. Interestingly enough, we always thought it's a privilege of the Lord. He becomes the owner of these stray animals. But then you realize, if you look through all the cases, the problem is very often that stray animals are the result of they are old, they are sick, they are no longer good for work.
So somebody's abandoned them.
It's actually not a privilege for the feudal lord to keep them, but it's an obligation to make sure they don't really do a lot of harm to his villagers. So you have very small it's a lot of legal court cases, but if you look at them and sum them up, it's really interesting evidence for daily life.
Well, a lot of people, going back to the very beginning things that we talked about, people have this weird idea about the Middle Ages. And a lot of people think that the lords of the manor could do anything they liked to their people without any kind of difficulty or anything. They could do terrible things. And it's like, no, no, the evidence is, as you say, here we've uncovered an obligation that they had, which actually is quite, feeding a horse for a year before it becomes yours.
Back to the horses now.
Yeah, I know.
And cleaning the stable. You have to pay someone for cleaning the stable as well.
Yeah. And then you've got this horse. And the reason this horse has been abandoned is because it's no good for anybody anymore.
Exactly.
They don't want it. It can't do its job anymore. Now, I've got a few rescue horses and some semi-retired horses. And obviously I can afford to look after them and, call the vet if necessary and do whatever needs to be done. But back in those days, it's probably a significant portion of your income, even if you're relatively wealthy by other standards. I just imagine people sort of taking advantage of that rule, and everybody actually knows whose horse that is. Nobody's saying anything. Don't tell.
Well, you have to ask Spike about all this, but it's really interesting. For me, it was like an eye-opener to sort of think about these things on this level.
Yes.
You see so much evidence and you can learn a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe that's another thing you asked in the beginning, the difference between today and then. We often think it was a chaotic time and unruled or unordered. But if you look in detail, take the Monte di Pietà, these microloan institutes, or take cooperatives and commons organization. It was all extremely well organized in terms of rules and, how do we look, for example, for our forest? Nobody owns it. It's our common good, but we all have to make sure it's not going to be exploited, not deforested and everything. And we do have rules that show, it's a very strict regulation. The villagers are clearly defined. It's not like no man's land. Everybody can go and get what he wants out of the forest. No, you have rules, and you have, especially very important, regular times and spaces of communication. Once a year, you have to meet up, and everybody comes, all the members of, for example, the forest cooperative. And then they meet to recall the rules. They meet to settle conflicts. They meet to sing and to drink and to dance, and also to decide about the next year and whether there is a lot of, timber needed for building houses. So one village might need more wood and another village might need more grazing land or, pigs in the forest. So we have very clear evidence that all this was very well organized. So again, that's something which we, as a prejudice, we think we should leave behind. And for one, it seems that they knew very well about what we today call rules of sustainable management of resources. And they fill into what Some people, like the economist Eleanor Ostrom, for example, she calls the law of common management of water resources or other resources. And I find it surprising. I think what I learned in writing my Green Ages was really a lot about the intelligence of these people. I mean, it's not like they were sort of little humans in a children state. That's what we often think. So, we started up very small and then we became adults. No, they were adults. And in many ways, I have the impression they were maybe more intelligent than we today.
I think so. And there were fewer people as well, which perhaps means you're more accountable.
Yeah.
Because the people you're working with and living with, you expect them to continue to live and work with you. And if you're disruptive, everybody knows about it. And they probably grew up with you. And they probably work out how to manage that between them all. And a new person coming in would come into a society that wasn't necessarily well ordered, but it was regulated. People sort of knew other people.
Yes.
And you would know very quickly, whether your neighbour's doing something dodgy, where the authorities probably don't know, but you certainly do if they've got too many pigs. And therefore, the consequences of overgrazing or chopping that tree down. And therefore, you don't need to go and tell the authorities as such. You sort of get together with your friends or extended family and work out how to deal with it, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, that can be very unpleasant,
Yes, well, that's true. The other
it's
side
a form
of that,
of social control we don't want. I mean, that's why we like the cities, we like anonymity. Mm-hmm. But it's maybe important.
I suppose when it works well.
Yeah.
And when it's badly applied, it's awful as well.
Yes, exactly. And I think we overrated the bad side of it for a long time because we sort of insisted on liberties and freedom as the one and only goal. And only now we realize, okay, maybe there are unintended consequences of these ideas. I mean, the fundaments of our definition of freedom, they build on a huge fossil resource of energies, and that makes life now for our children very hard.
I do sometimes wonder in 1,000 years what people will look back on from our century.
I know. I mean, I think the second half of the 20th century will be famous for having managed to fill the planet with waste that is not going to sort of rework into nature within half a century. I think that's really the most sustainable impact we left in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century.
Quite sad, isn't it?
It is very sad. Maybe what we lost after, in that period as well, is really rules or cultural techniques of establishing long-term thinking prospects. We became very sort of self-centered in our thinking. And only now we realize that long-term thinking is actually something very natural to people. I mean, we have a natural interest in the future existence of our children and grandchildren.
Yes.
But we sort of forgot about that.
Well, we could talk about that. We could go into it. We haven't really got time, but I was just going to finish on one of the things that I try to plant. I live on a farm, so I try to plant trees every year. I've got this sort of little rule, which is I try to plant 10 trees. I find a corner and I plant 10 trees on my land, or more if I can, but minimum of 10 trees a year.
And what sort of trees?
Well, it'd be oak trees, or it might be apple trees, or I was trying to introduce walnuts and trees that can give people joy and fruit. So I've got almond trees and walnut trees. And somebody said to me, in a way, planting a tree is a gift to the future.
Yep.
Because you'll be dead before those trees are very significant in the landscape.
Yes.
And I said, I don't really mind that because I like the idea of planting trees.
Yep.
And some of the big trees I've got some beautiful old oak trees, which are 300-400 years old, some of them, huge. And I think somebody planted that, or maybe they didn't, maybe it was wild seeded, but I think there's a fair chance they were planted by somebody. And in a way, that's the past and the future communicating via planting trees for the future. And who knows what the future holds. But if more of us did those little things, it will make a huge difference. There's so many of us around. Power comes from small positive actions in many cases, not always, and we need big action as well. But the little things, little changes you make can really substantially change the future.
I agree 120%. And I think what we underestimate is the role of communication. If you don't have a piece of land to plant a tree, you can have an impact with talking about things and redefining things. And I think planting trees is just a metaphor that is very beautiful. My father, by the way, he's 92 years old and he still plants trees.
Wonderful.
Wonderful, yeah. And I think that's a very powerful image or a metaphor that goes to the heart, and it's an action you can take. Even if you don't physically plant a tree, but you can plant ideas into other people's heads. So communication is really what's needed.
Wonderful. Well, I think we should end it there. I mean, we could talk for hours more, but we've a limited amount of time. If people want to follow your work, books, websites, how can they find you? Social media in the modern day?
Well, I'm not very up to date at the moment. I do have a homepage at the University of Mannheim. I am on LinkedIn, and then I have a book which is Profile Publishers, The Green Ages, Medieval Innovations in Sustainability. At the moment, 3 days ago, my second book was coming out in German on the 7 deadly sins. Traditional knowledge for the times of crisis. So we go on, and I'm trying to define and redefine traditional knowledge from the past.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. I hope people have learned a little bit about what the medieval period wasn't, in fact, and unlearned some things that film and TV has shown them.